The story of Notre Dame Cathedral begins in spring of 1163 with the laying of its cornerstone in the presence of Louis VII of France and Pope Alexander III. But this would not be the first religious building to occupy the site on the Ile de la Cité in Paris. In fact, it's speculated that the first structure to be built here was a Gallo-Roman temple dedicated to Jupiter. Pointing towards this is the pillar of the Boatmen, discovered during the construction of a new crypt in 1710. It was erected as a public monument by a guild of wealthy shipowners or traders sometime during the reign of Tiberius, who became emperor in 14 AD. The main inscription on the pillar is dedicated to Jovis Optimus Maximus, Jove the best and greatest, but it also mentions other Roman as well as Celtic gods. The first Christian building on the site was an early basilica, built sometime in the 4th century and dedicated to Saint Stephen. This Church of Saint Stephen was then renovated or possibly rebuilt in the 7th century by the Merovingian dynasty, and then again in 857 under the Carolingians, who turned it into a cathedral. Its final remodeling was in the Romanesque style, and although it had been enlarged and was an impressive structure for its time, it was still only about half the size of the later Notre Dame Cathedral and was deemed unfit for the growing population of Paris. This brings us back to 1163 and the laying of the cornerstone. The new cathedral was the brainchild of Maurice de Sully, the Bishop of Paris since 3 years back. He had immediately ordered the demolition of the old structure and intended to reuse its materials for his modern Gothic Cathedral of Notre Dame. The style had gotten its breakthrough just about 20 years earlier with the remodeling of the ambulatory at the Abbey of Saint-Denis, not far from the city. It's characterized by the use of pointed arches, as well as flying buttresses which allowed for tall buildings with lots of natural light. The names of the masters who now created the original design of Notre Dame have unfortunately not come down to us. By the time Maurice de Sully dies in 1196, the greater part of the cathedral had already been completed, but work continued on the site all the way up until the first half of the 14th century. For example, the transepts were remodeled in the latest Rayonnant Gothic style beginning in the 1240s and under the supervision of Jean de Chelles and Pierre de Montreuil. Buttresses were also added sometime in the 13th century, but these were replaced by larger and stronger ones a century later. Upon nearing its completion, the philosopher and theologian John of Jandun wrote of it, quote, "That most glorious church of the most glorious Virgin Mary, Mother of God, deservedly shines out like the sun among the stars." The cathedral received its first real damage in 1548, when rioting Huguenots destroyed some of its statues, considered by them to be idolatrous. During the following centuries, the choir was largely rebuilt in marble, and many of the original stained glass windows were replaced with white glass, more in compliance with the classical fashion of the day. A giant statue of Saint Christopher standing against a pillar near the western entrance and dating from 1413 was destroyed in 1786, and the spire, which had been damaged by wind, was removed at around the same time. With the coming of the French Revolution, the story of Notre Dame takes a drastic turn. The building, which was seen as a symbol of the Ancien Regime, was stripped of 28 statues on its western facade depicting kings. These were then brought to the cathedral square and decapitated, even though they were biblical and not French monarchs as they may have thought. In 1793, the building was rededicated as a temple of the cult of reason, a new revolutionary and atheist religion which was supposed to replace Christianity. The Virgin Mary was replaced with the goddess of liberty, and a Greek temple of philosophy was put up, adorned with busts of Voltaire, Rousseau, and other Enlightenment thinkers. The temple also contained an enthroned figure of reason, and on a mount thrown up in the choir burned the torch of truth. The radical cult of reason was later replaced by the cult of the Supreme Being, a form of deism which acknowledged the existence of a god. This led to Notre Dame once again being rededicated and hosting the Festival of the Supreme Being in 1794. After this cult eventually fell out of favor as well, the building was left as little more than a warehouse, storing food and wine among other things. It wouldn't be until 1802 that the then First Consul, Napoleon Bonaparte, restored the cathedral to the Catholic Church. 2 years later, he decided to hold his famous coronation ceremony here, for which much of the Gothic interior had been masked with fabrics and silk and velvet drapes, decorated with the coat of arms and insignia of the empire. Outside, a neo-Gothic portico had been put up by his favourite architects Percier and Fontaine, as well as a wooden gallery running alongside the cathedral ending by a giant tent. A number of nearby houses had also been demolished for the occasion, and the roads on which the cortege was to pass had all been paved. Napoleon continued to use Notre Dame for great imperial ceremonies, for example the reception of the banners of Austerlitz in 1806, and the baptism of his son and heir, the King of Rome, in 1811. The cathedral also witnessed the end of his regime, as it was the first place where Louis XVIII went on entering Paris in 1814. But despite all the splendid ceremonies, Notre Dame was, by the early 19th century, ruined and battered to the verge of demolition. Luckily, in 1831, the Hunchback of Notre Dame was published by Victor Hugo, and its enormous success brought new attention to the cathedral. In 1844, King Louis Philippe ordered that the church be restored, and the commission for the restoration was won by two architects, Jean-Baptiste Antoine Lassus and Eugène Viollet de Duc. They would spend the next 25 years restoring the building in what they considered its original spirit, sometimes adding new elements where they lacked historical documentation. They also added a taller and more ornate version of the original spire, and it's this 19th century version of it that collapsed in the fire on April 15th. Notre Dame once again faced destruction in 1871, during the final days of the Paris Commune. The Vendôme column had been destroyed on May 16th, the Tuileries Palace burned on the 23rd, and now the revolutionaries turned towards the cathedral, whose destruction would serve as a gesture against the partnership of the church with imperialism. But to their great surprise, the arsonists were upon entering the building met by an armed battalion of Commune artists, and were persuaded to leave. Another close call for the building was during World War II, when the retreating Germans had gotten orders from Hitler to destroy as much as possible of Paris. Luckily, the German military commander managed to fake his commitment to the orders for long enough that the city, including Notre Dame, could be saved. Upon the liberation of Paris in November 1944, de Gaulle and his men could attend a Mass of Thanksgiving here. Since then, the cathedral has undergone several renovations, many of them focusing on the facade. The latest one has taken place during the 2010s, and since late 2018, a renovation of the spire had been underway, requiring for the temporary removal of statues and other decorative elements from the roof, thus saving them from the fire.